So today we're going to cover Chapter 1, Section 4B, and we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations using completing the square. So these are the steps. What we're going to do is we're going to keep the ax squared and the bx term on the left side of the equal sign. So remember, we're moving the constant to the other side of the equal sign. Now, if there's a number in front of x squared, we need to factor it out. After we've moved the constant, we take the b term, we're going to divide it by 2 and square it. That's what we're going to add to both the left and the right side to keep our equation balanced. Then after that, we're going to factor the perfect square trinomial that we created, and then we'll use the square root technique. And then we'll go ahead and move anything that we have to isolate x for. So what I'm talking about here with the a and the b and the c. So this is your equation. It must be in standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So what we're going to start out first by doing is all of the equations that have an a value of 1. These will be the easy ones. And then I'll do one where the a value is not 1, and we'll have to factor it out. Okay, so here is our first example. Notice it's in standard form. So step number 1 is I'm going to move the constant, the 14, to the other side of the equal sign. Now, what I'm going to do, just like in that video, I'm going to leave a little blank space. So I'm going to leave a blank space here, the equal sign, and then the 14, and then a blank space. What I'm filling in that blank space is that b term divided by 2 and squared. So I'm going to take my b term. So remember, my a here is 1, my b is -4, and my c was the -14, the constant, and I moved it to the other side. So now I'm taking my b term, I'm dividing it by 2, and then I need to square it. -4 divided by 2 is -2, and then this gives me 4. So technically what I'm doing here is I am adding 4 to both sides of my equation. But I'm going to show you a little trick that I like to do to make it easier when it comes time to factoring our perfect square trinomial we just created. So now the next step is to take this perfect square trinomial that you just created. We just now made a perfect square trinomial, and we were looking for factors of 4 that give me -4, and those factors are -2 and -2. So it turns into x minus 2 squared, and then I add the 14 and the 4. Now, what I like to do is instead of putting in +4 on the left side and on the right side, I definitely have to put the +4, the b term divided by 2 squared, over here. However, over here what I like to do, instead of putting it in as a +4, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to put it in what it was before I squared it. So I'm going to put it on my blank space here as a -2 squared. So instead of putting it in as +4, I'm going to put it in as -2 squared, because then that shows me exactly what's going to go on my binomial. And then it's the x minus. Now we're going to use the square root method, or square root both sides. So I'm now going to square root both sides. Remember, when you square root this binomial that's squared, it cancels it. So out of this will come x minus 2. This becomes plus and minus the square root of 18. I need to break down the 18. So this is just like last night's homework. So the square root of 18, I can factor this into either 3 and 6 or 9 and 2. I'm going to choose 9 and 2 because I know 9 is a perfect square. So then this simplifies to 3 square root 2. So now I have x minus 2 equals plus and minus 3 square root 2. add the 2 to both sides, and my final answer is x is equal to 2 plus or minus 3 square root 2. On WebAssign, just like last night, it's going to expect you to pull it apart. So you're going to enter it in as 2 minus 3 square root 2, and then 2 plus 3 square root 2. So for WebAssign, you're going to enter them separately, and you're going to separate them with the comma. All right, so again, it's in standard form. So step number 1, check to make sure that this number in front of your x squared is a 1, and it is. So step number 1, move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to add 1 to the other side. I'm going to write down my a and my b term. I'm going to leave my little blank space here. And then 1, and then the blank space. I need to take the b term, divide it by 2, and square it. Remember, your b term is that 6. So I'm going to do 6 divided by 2 and square it. So this becomes 3 squared, and that equals 9. So remember, the 9 is what I'm writing over here on the right side. On the left side, I'm going to put it in as plus 3 squared. So that way, when I go to factor my trinomial, my perfect square trinomial I just formed, I already know what my binomial is. It's going to be x plus 3 squared. The sign that'll be there in between the x and the number is the sign of the middle term. And then now I have to add 1 and 9. I get 10. And now I do the square root. So square root both sides. I end up with x. I get plus 3 equals positive and negative square root 10. Now, if I try to do a factor tree to break down the 10, it's just 2 times 5. I don't have any pairs, so I just leave the square root of 10 alone, and then move the 3 over. And then I get x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 10. Again, remember, WebAssign is going to expect you to pull it apart. So you're going to enter it as negative 3 minus the square root of 10, and then negative 3 plus the square root of 10. We're going to move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. Going to set up my x squared plus 2x, blank space, 5, blank space. What I'm filling in the blank space is my b term divided by 2. So my b term is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So 1 squared, which just equals 1. So what I'll fill in here is I'm going to show it as a 1 squared. And then here it's just plus 1. You could just put it in as a plus 1, but again, if you're thinking on using that as your trick to factor, then you just take that 1 squared, put it there, but surround it with parentheses, and then you'll do 5 plus 1, you get 6, and now we need to square root both sides. The square rooting the square just makes that x plus 1 come out, and then now plus or minus the square root of 6. I can't simplify the square root of 6, so I just leave it alone. Subtract the 1. And now I get x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 6. And again, WebAssign wants you to pull it apart. So negative 1 minus the square root of 6, and then negative 1 plus the square root of 6. My b term was an even number. So when I divided it by 2, I didn't have any kind of decimals or fractions. On number 4, my b term is an odd number. I'm not going to make it a decimal. I'm going to leave it an improper fraction. So let's try it. So for number 4, it's in standard form. The number in front of x squared is a 1. So all I need to do is move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. X squared plus 7x, blank space, negative 12, blank space. I'm taking my b term, I'm dividing it by 2 and squaring it. So I need to actually square it. This gives me 49 over 4. I'm not going to make it 3.5. So when I fill it into my blank space, I'm going to put this in as 7 over 2 squared. But over here, I put the 49 over 4. Now, when I go to factor the left side, it's nice and easy. It's just going to be x plus 7 over 2 squared. However, the right side, I need to find a common denominator because I'm adding a fraction here to an integer. So I need to do negative 12 over 1 plus 49 over 4. My common denominator here is going to be a 4. So I'm going to change the negative 12 and make it negative 48 over 4. Because I'm timesing both the numerator and the denominator by a 4 to make it have a common denominator. Now I can add the fractions. Negative 48 plus 49 gives me 1/4. I now square root both sides of my equation. So square root this side and this side. Now for this one, you could do it separately. Square root of 1 over the square root of 4, which is going to give me 1/2. So this will give me plus and minus 1/2. And then the x plus 7 over 2 comes out. Now, when this answer over here ends up coming out of the radical because it was a perfect square, I actually have to get the two answers. So let me come on over here to the side. So now what I'm going to do is to get my x values, I have x plus 7 over 2 equals negative 1/2. I actually have to solve this. And then x plus 7 over 2 equals positive 1/2. I actually have to do the problems here. So I'm going to subtract 7 over 2. This gives me x equals negative 8 over 2, which is negative 4. Over here, subtract the 7 over 2 on this one. I get negative 6 over 2, which simplifies to negative 3. So my two solutions here are going to be negative 3 and negative 4. This is what x equals. So for number 5, same scenario. The number in front of x squared is a 1. So I'm going to go ahead and add the 6 to both sides. X squared minus 3x, blank space, 6, blank space. I'm going to take my b term. I'm going to divide it by 2 and square it. And then this gives me 9 over 4. But again, remember, in my blank space here, I'm going to put it in as minus 3 over 2 squared. And then over here, I put the plus 9 over 4. So when I go to factor this, it's just x minus 3 over 2 squared. I need to find a common denominator here. So 6 over 1 plus 9 over 4. Again, I'm going to multiply the numerator and the denominator by a 4, make this 24 over 4. And then now I can add 24 plus 9, and I get 33 over 4. Square root both sides. And again, when I square root this, I can do it individually. So then this will become x minus 3 over 2 equals plus and minus square root 33, but then the square root of 4 is a positive 2. So let me come over here to the side. So now I have x minus 3 over 2 equals positive negative square root 33 over 2. I need to add 3 over 2 to both sides. X is equal to 3 over 2 plus or minus square root 33 over 2. Notice they already have a common denominator. So if you want to write it as 3 plus or minus square root 33 over 2, you can do it that way. Or WebAssign wants you to pull it apart. Now, another thing you could do is you could factor out this 2, or you could make it 1/2 times 3 plus or minus square root 33. Just be able to recognize all of these answers. Okay, this would be another way to write it. On WebAssign, you're going to do 3 minus the square root of 33 over 2, 3 plus the square root of 33 over 2. Or again, you could also do the 1/2 and then just do 3 minus root 33, comma, 1/2, 3 plus. All of these are acceptable answers. You know, be able to recognize all of these maybe for a PSAT or an SAT. This one, number 6. So first thing you need to do before you move that constant is check to see if this number in front of x squared is a 1, and it's not. So I need to divide out the 9 or factor it out. So now this ends up becoming x squared, and then 12 over 9 will simplify to 4 over 3. And then minus the 1/9. Now I'm going to start my same process that I just did. I move the constant to the other side. And now I have x squared minus 4/3 x, blank space, equals 1/9, blank space. Now, my b term is a fraction. So I am taking negative 4/3. I'm dividing it by 2. But if you realize that divide by 2 is the same thing as multiply by 1/2. So whenever my b term is a fraction, instead of saying divide by 2, I'm going to do multiply by 1/2. And then I'm going to square it. So then this will actually simplify. You don't have to simplify diagonally, but I like to do that. So then this turns into negative 2/3 squared. I have to square it, and it gives me 4/9. This is what I'm going to add to the right side. This is what I'm going to put in on my left side, so I don't have to think about what I'm factoring. So in here, I'm going to put the minus 2/3 squared, or the negative 2/3 squared, and then over here, plus the 4/9. So now when I factor the trinomial, this turns into x minus 2/3 squared equals, already has a common denominator, so it's 5/9. I now need to square root both sides. Square rooting that square just makes it come out. So x minus 2/3 is equal to, and again, you can square root this individually because 9's a perfect square. So then this becomes plus and minus square root 5 over 3. And now move the 2/3 to the other side. And I get x is equal to 2/3 plus or minus the square root of 5 over 3. So again, you could write it with one denominator if you want, because they're both a 3. So this would be an acceptable answer on the test. However, WebAssign wants you to pull it apart. So you would do 2 minus the square root of 5 over 3, comma, 2 plus the square root of 5 over 3. So we're going to do number 7. Okay, so for number 7, now, step number 1, when you're completing the square, is first just make sure it's in standard form. Then the next thing you're looking at is to make sure that this number in front of x squared is a 1. It's not. So I need to divide all of my terms here by 3, and then I'm left with x squared plus 2/3 x minus 5/3 equals 0. My next step is to move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to move the 5/3. I'm going to make my little blank space here. So I have x squared plus 2/3 x blank space equals 5/3 and then a blank space. Remember, the next step is to take the b term. So this 2/3, and I'm going to divide it by 2 and square it. So what I'm going to do is divide by 2 is the same thing as multiply by a half. So I'm going to go ahead and this will simplify, and this becomes 1/3 squared, which then turns into 1/9 when I square it. But remember, this is what I'm putting on my left side, and then this is what I'll put on the right side, on my blank spaces. So up here, I'm going to put plus the 1/3 squared, and over here, I'm going to put the plus 1/9. Now what I need to do is add these fractions over here. So I need to do 5/3 plus 1/9, common denominator, it's going to be 9. So this will turn into 15/9, and then I can add it and get 16/9. So now my equation, let me bring it down here. So now I have x squared plus 2/3 x plus the 1/3 squared equals 16/9. I now need to factor the trinomial. So remember, by putting it in like this already tells me what goes into my binomial. And now I'm going to square root both sides. Causes the x plus 1/3 to come out. Notice in my fraction here, if I were to square root these individually, this will give me plus or minus square root of 16 is 4, square root of 9 is 3. And then now I'm going to move the 1/3. And I get x is equal to negative 1/3 plus or minus 4/3. Now, on the test, you can't leave it like this. You actually have to give me the two answers. Now, if it were a radical, you could leave it. But when the answer that's there was a perfect square, we actually have to do x equals negative 1/3 minus 4/3, and x equals negative 1/3 plus 4/3. This gives me negative 5/3, and this one gives me 3/3, which is 1. So the two answers are negative 5/3 and positive 1. So when the radical disappears, you can't leave it as plus minus. You have to do the two problems. All right. All right, so for number 8, again, I've got a number in front of my x squared, so I have to divide everything by 3 first. So divide by 3, divide by 3, and then this ends up being x squared minus 4/3 x minus 1/3 equals 0. I need to move the constant to the other side, so I'm going to add 1/3 to both sides. And now I have x squared minus 4/3 x blank space 1/3 blank space. The next step is to take the b term, that negative 4/3, and I need to divide it by 2. So I'm taking my b term, divide by 2, and squaring it. So my b term was negative 4/3. Divide by 2 is the same as multiplying by a half, and then I square it. This will simplify diagonally. I can change that to a 1 and a 2. And then now I'm left with negative 2/3 and I got to square that, and I get 4/9. This is what I'm going to put in the left side in that blank space, and this is what I'm going to put in the right side. Technically, I could put 4/9 on both sides, but then you got to remember how to go back and factor that. So what I'm going to fill in here is the plus negative 2/3 squared, and over here, plus 4/9. Now I have to factor the trinomial, and again, by putting it in as the negative 2/3 squared, that already tells me what it factors to. And then I have to find a common denominator, though, for the 1/3 and the 4/9. So 1/3 plus 4/9. Common denominator here is going to be a 9. So I'm going to change the 1/3, and I'm going to make this 3/9. And then add it to the 4/9, and I get 7/9. Now I have to square root both sides. So square root that side and that side. And again, if you want to think of it as the 7 gets its own little radical and the 9 gets its own. So then the x minus 2/3 comes out of the radical. So then now I have x minus 2/3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7 over 3. I now need to just add the 2/3 to both sides. And I get x is equal to 2/3 plus or minus the square root of 7 over 3. Now, WebAssign wants you to pull it apart, so you can put it in as x is equal to 2 minus the square root of 7 over 3, and then 2 plus the square root of 7 over 3. On the test, you could also take this and you could just put it with 1 3 in the bottom. So this is for the test. This would be WebAssign. You could do 2 plus or minus the square root of 7 over 3. So you can either leave your answer like this or like this for the test, but on WebAssign you have to pull it apart. So for number 9, we need to divide everything by 5. So divide by 5, divide by 5. So then now I'm left with x squared minus 7/5 x minus 1/5 equals 0. I need to add the constant to the other side. X squared minus 7/5 x blank space 1/5 blank space. I now take the b term, divide it by 2. So negative 7/5 divided by 2 is multiplied by 1/2. And then I square that. This gives me negative 7 over 10. And then when I square that, I get 49 over 100. So this is what's going on the left side in that blank space, and this is what I put on the right side. So in here, I'll put the negative 7/10 squared, and over here, I'm going to put the 49 over 100. Let me do that so it shows up better. All right, so now on this side, I need to find a common denominator. It's going to be 100. So I'm going to change the 1/5 into 20 over 100. So 20 over 100 plus 49 over 100 gives me 69 over 100. So now I factor x minus 7/10 squared is equal to 69 over 100. I now need to square root both sides, and this gives me x minus 7/10 equals, and again, if you want to think of it as the square root of 69 and then the square root of 100, this gives me plus or minus the square root of 69 over 10. And now you're just gonna add the 7 over 10 to both sides to isolate x. And x is equal to 7 over 10 plus or minus the square root of 69 over 10. And then here, if you'd rather just put it with 110 in the denominator, you can do that. Again, WebAssign is going to expect you to do 7 minus the square root of 69 over 10, comma, or if it's 2 boxes, plus, and then over 10. And then the one last example. I'm going to just rewrite the problem because I've written all over the place here. All right, so the last one, I'll write it down here. So number 10 has a negative x squared plus 3x plus 5 equals 0. Again, I need a positive 1 in front of that x squared, so I need to divide everything by negative 1. So then now it becomes positive x squared minus 3x minus 5 equals 0. I need to move the constant to the other side. X squared minus 3x, blank space, and then the 5, blank space. Take the b term, divide it by 2, and square it, and this gives me 9 over 4. So plus 9 over 4 on the right, and then here I'll put the plus negative 3/2 squared. I need to find a common denominator. So 5 over 1 plus 9 over 4. This ends up being 20 over 4. And then add the numerators. So this will add to 29 over 4. Factor the trinomial, x minus 3 over 2 squared. And now square root both sides. So square root. Again, think of it as the 29 and the 4 having its own little radical. So then this gives me x minus 3 over 2 plus or minus the square root of 29, and then the square root of 4 is 2, and then add the 3 over 2. And then x is equal to 3 over 2 plus or minus the square root of 29 over 2. Yes? So WebAssign, so on the test, you can do this and make one fraction like she said. And then WebAssign, if you want to make one fraction with a 2, you can do that. Or you can give it its own little fractions.